Hey everyone, before we get into today's show, I have something so exciting to share with all of you. And that is that I am starting work on my next book, which is going to explore something that is a little bit terrifying and something that makes me very uncomfortable, and that is vulnerability. And the reason why this terrifies me and makes me uncomfortable is because I am not a vulnerable person. I'm specifically going to be looking at vulnerability and leadership. But here is the best part. I want to include you in the book. I am looking for stories, insights, and experiences from all of you leaders out there who have been vulnerable at work, whether that ended up helping or hurting you. If you want to be featured in my upcoming book and a soon-to-be-released podcast exploring vulnerability and leadership, then please take a few minutes to answer some questions that you can find at thevulnerabilieadersurvey.com. Again, that's thevulnerabilieadersurvey.com. I will be sharing much more on this in the coming weeks and months, but for now, I'm looking forward to reading what you have to say about vulnerability and leadership.
The first one that we talked about is loss aversion. This notion that we experience the pain of a loss much more intensely than we feel the joy from a gain. So we go to extremes to avoid a potential loss. And you see that everywhere from consumer pricing to stocks to sports, where you're so afraid of losing. Even look at Vietnam War, where Johnson, LBJ, was so afraid of losing the war that changed his behavior to from basically cutting it and getting out to how to avoid that loss. You have the concept of consistency. So once you're bought into something, once you've already started on the path, it's very difficult to cut. We are invested in something and we have too much of an attachment to it. You think about that again, investing, it happens all the time. Or you have an employee that's not great, but you're like, oh gosh, I've invested so much of my energy on this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Future of Work podcast. My guest today, Ori Brafman, distinguished teaching fellow at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business and New York Times bestselling author. He's written a couple of books, The Starfish and the Spider, and also Sway, The Irresistible Pull of Irrational Behavior. We're going to be talking about both of those books and some other fun stuff that Ori's working on now. Ori, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, I have to ask, the world has been pretty crazy over the past few years. When you look at what's going on as far as the world of work and business, what do you think is going on? What are your general thoughts and perceptions?
What do you mean things are going crazy? Where do I begin?
What are you talking about? Everything's fine.
Everything's fine. Where do we begin? I think that one of the biggest forces that we're facing is a combination of decentralization, distributed power, and the increased polarization based on individual values. And I think that it's a super interesting combination, which is very unstabilizing for society, and also at the same time, I think very empowering to a lot of folks. So it's and my one of my books, it's the only book that's actually out of print. I write about it was called The Chaos Imperative, but it looked at the plague in Europe and how the plague really set the stage for the Renaissance. And I wonder whether all of this chaos that's going on around us
Hmm.
today is potentially going to lead to a renaissance that we can't really imagine. So I would say those are the forces.
All right, wait, question about that. So Renaissance in which way? Do you mean in creating better organizations and like just societal improvement, or what could this kind of a Renaissance look like for us?
That's a great question. I think that it could certainly be a renaissance in terms of society and art and culture. I think that we are in a period where we're reimagining the role of institutions.
Yeah.
It's obviously an issue that there's so little trust in organizations. And at the same time, I think that big institutions need to come to terms with the fact that, hey, if you're losing public trust, what does that mean? How does that change your behavior?
Yeah.
I think about kids who are growing up today and imagining what's feasible in terms of societal change. For example, you look at BLM and the enormous amount of change that these protests have had and the reckoning that we're having on a national and international level is pretty amazing. And I wonder whether that can lead to an exploration of what is feasible and what can individuals actually do, as opposed to like 10 years ago, where you're saying like, wow, this is just going to be the same, and it is going to be the same.
Yeah.
This shows us that things are can be pretty appended.
Well, and I think they're so I very much think of the kind of the same thing, and I think of it as kind of a renaissance for organizations. You know, for so many years we've had these organizations where people just didn't like their jobs, they didn't want to show up to work, and now it's becoming so hard to find and attract people that I think organizations and leaders are finally realizing, hey, we got to treat people like human beings. So I at least hope that there's going to be some kind of like a organizational renaissance where we create these, great companies that treat people well and put people first. I don't know, maybe not, but hopefully.
Hopefully, and you're certainly seeing that people are having more flexibility, and that people
Yeah.
are, so because of the pandemic, I think people are, I mean, I know I took stock of my life and saying like, what am I actually doing? What do I enjoy? What's energizing to me? What's not energizing to me? What I want to, I think the pandemic has been a forced midlife crisis in all of us.
Yeah.
Even my 22-year-old college students, they're like, okay, this really is making me take stock of what's going on in my life, and has empowered individuals in a lot of ways. I do think that, yeah, it's going to have a reckoning with
Yeah.
companies about how do you actually treat people.
Yep. Well, let's talk a little bit about your first book. So Starfish and the Spider, I think, did that come out 2006? Is that right?
Yeah,
Which is crazy to think that it came out almost 20 years ago.
that
Um,
is insane. Yeah,
like
absolutely.
2 decades. And that book was really all about leaderless organizations. And it's been interesting over the last 20 or so years. So after you wrote that book and, we had a decade or two go by, when you think about the concepts from that book, do you still believe in those concepts of decentralized, leaderless organizations? Do you think they're still effective, or has your perception changed at all over the years?
I think it's all bullshit. No, I'm kidding. I
Suckers who bought it.
I I'm actually surprised by just how on the dot it was, to be honest.
Hmm.
So, I mean, the book argues that you take a spider, cut off the head, it dies. You cut off the arm of a starfish, it goes on back, and think about it as a metaphor for business and society. Everything from Alcoholics Anonymous to Wikipedia, and you think about, so when the first book came out, I was on a plane to New York to go on shows for the launch, and this woman started talking to me. She's like, "Oh, what are you doing? Why are you going to New York?" And like that doesn't usually happen, where people just are like, "What are you doing on this plane?" I'm like, and I I said, well, I wrote my first book. This is really exciting. And she looks at me. She's like, I just don't get it. Like, why would anyone care? And I'm like, and it kind of uh, drained my energy so much. And she's like, people aren't going to make money off this. Who cares? And of course, we look almost 20 years later, and you look at politically, the Tea Party basically said that they use Starfish as their Bible of how to start a political movement. You look at blockchain currencies and you see them referencing Starfish again and again and again. You see international protest movements, really everything from Occupy to the Hong Kong protests, all really following the formula of decentralization. And really, that formula is that the harder that you fight a decentralized opponent, the stronger it becomes and the more powerful it becomes. And that it really changes the rules of the game. And you're seeing that even today in um, stock market. You look at GameStop, for example, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
look at how, right? And all of these individuals who are able to very loosely coordinate without really a central leader, and the huge effect that they're having on the price of the stock. So I think you're seeing it everywhere. I don't think I even imagined just how much the world would change in these last 60 years,
Yeah.
70 years.
All right. So you still think this concept of a decentralized or leaderless organization could do well?
I still think it could do well, yes.
Well, because
And
we've tried. You remember like holacracy, and there was like all these different types of models that emerged over the years. And I think companies like Zappos tried to implement things like holacracy, and they didn't go that well. So I think there's been like, I don't know. I'd say mixed attempts at organizations to try to revisit their structures, and I don't know. It's been kind of mixed, I think.
I think holacracy is interesting. I think that where it gets super interesting is the combo special.
Hmm.
So I don't. I think that starting to see starfish organizations within spider organizations is going to be where it's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. No, I guess in that case, and you don't hear much about holacracy anymore these days, do you?
Yeah, and I think that Zappos had you know, some of their unique challenges, and I do wonder whether it can be implemented in a less extreme form
Yeah.
and and have an impact.
Well, so many organizations out there do have leaders, right? They do have managers. So how maybe we can take a step back and explain the concept of what a decentralized organization actually is and how it operates, and if you have any favorite examples of organizations who run in that way.
The best example is probably for our discussion is Wikipedia as opposed to, say, Encyclopedia Britannica. So Encyclopedia Britannica, back when they existed, you have a bunch of experts who are writing these entries and writing these articles. And Wikipedia turns around and says, you know what, anybody can contribute. Generally, anybody can contribute. They institute very low bars to make sure that you're a real person, etc., etc. And the reason the model works so well is the concept of minimum marginal utility. So that no one, as far as I know, no one gets rich from writing Wikipedia articles. But there's a benefit because the cost of entry is so low. There's a there's a benefit to just say like, hey, I have an article that's up, and um, you take some pride in it. In the same way that you might have pride in a YouTube video that you made or a TikTok video that you made. And the idea of decentralization as a more efficient way of coordination and a more efficient way for people to get stuff done. So a spider organization will have a CEO who's in charge. A starfish organization will generally have what we call catalysts. So a catalyst creates a network and mostly gets out of the way. A spider organization will have siloed department. A starfish organization will have a network where people are more organized around circles and abide by shared values as opposed to simply a command and control.
So if you have a CEO, does that automatically make you a spider organization?
Depends, right? Depends how much power we wield. So there are extreme spiders and there are extreme starfish.
Okay.
Extreme spiders is, think Moscow during the Cold War or Moscow today. And you're very top down, you give orders, and you're incredibly structured. An extreme starfish organization, I hate to use this as a positive example, but you think about Al Qaeda or you think about some of the terror networks. So I present regularly at the Marines, at the university, and ask them, okay, let's say that you are fighting Nazis and it's 1940. What do you do? 1941. Say, well, we we invade Europe, we roll out tanks, whatever it is that we're going to take on this opponent. And I said, okay, now it's the year 2022, and you have to take on Nazis. And I'm not talking about figurative Nazis. This is not like making things extreme. These are full on Nazis. Um, how do you take them on when they've become more distributed and you have attacks like the horrible one in New Zealand, and they're loosely coordinated, and the the videos of the attacks create other videos and create other ideas for attacks. How do you take that on? It's a completely different animal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. But I think a lot of so most organizations today obviously have CEOs. They obviously have leaders in there. But I know a lot of these organizations are also trying to be a little bit more, not decentralized, but they're trying to give employees more autonomy, more authority, more freedom to make decisions. So is there some kind of in between being a starfish and a spider?
Yes, the combo special. So how do you empower employees in the most effective way? How do you give them an opportunity to contribute? And really, how do you start changing the equation as opposed to just taking utility and extracting it out of employees? How do you change that to, we have to give something back to employees?
Hmm.
And uh, it's interesting. This isn't just a nice to have. This is actually a way of making people more effective and productive because you're empowering individuals to actually contribute in effective ways.
Yeah, it's something I've been talking about for many years. And I feel like before there was a lot of this mentality of like, oh, it's kind of a nice to have, it's not a requirement. I've talked a lot about employee experience. And now it seems like we finally got to a point where people are realizing that it's actually crucial to put people first, to focus on their experiences, to create a place where they genuinely want, not where they need to show up to work each day. But I feel like it's taken a pandemic for a lot of leaders and organizations to realize that.
Isn't it interesting? It's taking people actually leaving and employees realizing, hey, I don't need to stay in this construct and in this frame.
Yeah. Yeah, which is crazy. And it's now organizations are freaking out. They're calling it the Great Recession, and I've heard people say it's not the Great Recession; it's actually the Great Escape. A lot of employees are escaping their organizations where they were not happy there, and now we're starting to figure out what do we need to do to get these people back. Oh, sorry, look like you were going to say something.
No, I agree.
Okay, so when we think about this kind of the starfish and the spider model, I'm trying to think about obviously organizations that have a CEO and they're mid or larger in scale. They're not all of a sudden going to become decentralized, right? They're not all of a sudden going to get rid of their CEO and say we're switching our model to networks and we're not going to have a hierarchy anymore. How do you go about not becoming a complete starfish, but starting from like if you're very hierarchical to becoming less hierarchical, right? Being that in the middle kind of company.
So over the last 12 years, I've been working a lot with Department of Defense, and you think about the military being very hierarchical. And even the US military is realizing that in order to be more effective, they need to be more starfish and more decentralized. And you have arguably the most powerful organization that's ever existed in the history of humanity in terms of their ability to exert their will on other people. And what's happened is they've been encountering these networks and not being as successful at actually fighting a war with a network. Now, the military realized that in order to fight starfish, they need to be more starfish themselves. It doesn't mean sell off the Pentagon and take away hierarchy, which is kind of, I think, the extreme that Zappos went to, right? It's if you have the military and you're like, okay, no more command, everyone, let's figure this stuff out. Like, it doesn't take a lot of imagination and genius to realize, like, okay, that's not going to work. Like, if you're taking a piece of equipment and you need to mobilize it from Kansas to somewhere in Asia, like you want a very command and control system doing that. But if you're talking more about decision making on the ground, you actually want that to be a more starfish, decentralized approach. So within the hierarchy, you maintain the hierarchy for the things that the hierarchy is very efficient for, but you enable starfish for things that it is more efficient for. And some of those things are creating a sense of imagination.
Okay.
So being able to be closer to knowledge is at the edge of the network, to be able to respond to that knowledge and to say like, hey, this is the way that the world is actually changing. To be able to draw creativity from individuals, to empower them in certain ways. And I generally think that in terms of hierarchy is very good for the what. You don't want a million people in the room deciding what to do. You want that very centralized.
Yeah.
The how is actually very good at being distributed.
Okay.
And what we tend to do is we tend to centralize the how and decentralize the what. All right, everyone, okay, this is a suggestion box. What should we do? And then there's like, okay, here's how you're going to do it. It should be the opposite. Like, be very, very specific about the what and then distribute the how and empower individuals to organize around that.
So it's kind of like, it makes me think of that. It's sort of the idea of a leader, right? I mean, a leader's job is to kind of set the destination and to help other people, supposed to be help you set the destination and allow people to figure out how to best get to that destination. And it sounds like that's the ideal scenario. Don't say, hey, where should we go? You set the goal and you help everybody else figure out, okay, this is where we need to go. How are we actually going to get there?
Exactly.
Okay.
And we're also getting into this interesting world where you're combining a lot of forces. You're taking decentralization, you're taking cryptocurrency, you're taking the metaverse, And for good or bad, I think people are going to start kind of living their lives and doing work on in that environment, which is very conducive to decentralization.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, if they're using their own internal currency, what does that do? Like, I think about if I'm a kid in Germany, and I know that there's people who want to learn German in America. Like, can I set up my little German tutoring course, whether it's on Facebook or Meta or whatever, or another platform? I can start accepting payment using tokens. I'm pretty autonomous all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And what does that do to the labor force? And what does that do as a competitive force to other companies that are much more spider? I say that if you don't know who the Starfish is in your industry, you're like the poker player who doesn't know who the worst player at the table is.
So you should know. So I guess that's something for people to take a step back and just kind of think about who is the starfish in your company, who's the spider in your company, and then what are the benefits that people might be wondering? Well, why should I become the starfish? Why bother doing it?
What about doing it? From an economic perspective, it's more efficient, is the short answer.
Okay.
The longer answer is that someone will enter the in, someone else will enter the industry and be more starfish because it's a more efficient way of getting things done, and they'll eat your lunch.
That's a good enough reason. Yeah.
Right? Think about music industry or um and back in the 2000s and pirating,
Yeah.
and all the money was in records, and those were very protected. And all of a sudden, there's so much pirating going on, and now we're seeing a world where the money is no longer necessarily making records. The money is in live shows. Think about Encyclopedia Britannica. People would say like, do you remember like growing up and having an encyclopedia?
I do. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah, right. When was the last time you bought an encyclopedia for your family?
Can you still even buy one?
No,
Do they even sell them
they don't.
anymore?
They don't sell them anymore. Britannica went out of business,
Jeez.
and industry after industry is going. It first affected the highly technological industries, and technology is a huge enabler for decentralization.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to affect industry after industry after industry because it's just a more effective and economically efficient way of getting things done.
Yeah. All right, let's switch gears and talk about your other book, Sway, the Irresistible Pull of Irrational Behavior, which I thought was a very interesting book. What made you write that?
So after I wrote Starfish, and Starfish really looks at take away centralization and really understand how people interact with another through the lens of networks. And once you look at people from the network, then you look at each node of the network and you say, okay, how do people actually make decisions? And we have this. So I teach at a business school. I went to business school. We have a little bit of a myth department, and that myth department is economics. It it's the only department that people win Nobel prizes for proving exceptions to the rule. So people don't behave in classic economic fashion. They behave based on emotions and based on psychological forces that we need to acknowledge, which is kind of where behavioral economics comes in.
Hmm.
And in that book, we looked at one of the most interesting stories was the story of this guy named Jacob Van Zanten, who was the head of safety for KLM Airlines,
Oh, I remember that story.
right? And he's flying a 747. He just finished teaching a course on airline safety. His plane gets diverted to this tiny little island. He starts stressing out about getting out of there on time because he's known as being the on time guy. And he tries to do everything he can in order to get out of the airport on time. And finally, the diversion gets lifted, and he rushes to the end of the runway. And he's sitting at the edge of the runway, and there's a fog that goes over the airport. And that's when Van Zanten does the unthinkable. And again, this is the head of safety for KLM. He takes off without clearance into a foggy runway.
Hmm.
As he takes off, there's another plane that's blocking the runway, causing the biggest loss of life accident in aviation history. And you think about how can the head of safety for KLM do this thing? And it's not like he was a bad pilot. It's not like he was drunk. It's these forces apply to all of us, and if they apply to the head of safety of the airline, they're also going to apply to me. And I need to look at things from that lens of uh, the forces that really affect our behaviors.
So what are some of those forces?
Some of the big ones are, so the first one that we talked about is loss aversion. This notion that we experience the pain of a loss much more intensely than we feel uh, the joy from a gain. So we go to extremes to avoid a potential loss. And you see that everything, everywhere from consumer pricing to stocks to sports, where you're so afraid of losing. Even look at Vietnam War, where Johnson, LBJ, was so afraid of losing the war that changes behavior to from basically cutting it and getting out to how to avoid that loss. You have the concept of consistency. So once you're bought into something, once you've already started on the path, it's very difficult to cut. We are invested in something and we have too much of an attachment to it. You think about that again, investing, it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Or you have an employee that's not great, but you're like, oh gosh, I've invested so much of my energy on this. Um,
Or you even
and
have it when you're watching a show on TV, like a Netflix show, and you know the show sucks, but you've already watched 3 episodes, and you're thinking, "Damn it, now I got to watch the rest of it, even though it's terrible."
oh my gosh, yeah, that totally happens to you, right? You're like, you're hate binging, and you're like, you hate yourself for doing it, but you're like, I'm already
Yeah, I
invested,
got to see
and
what happens.
you got to see what happens, and you tell yourself like, I'm the kind of person who's once I make a commitment, I'll 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 finish the commitment. Um, you have the role of fairness, how we need things to feel fair, and you think about that in uh, the job and in the workplace, how if people don't think things are fair, they become very irrational. And this is why it's so important to uh, have a process that feels just to people.
Hmm.
And these are forces that play on us every single day, all the time.
Yeah.
We just need to recognize that they play that big role.
And so, what do you do? I mean, obviously, in the case of this pilot, the forces kind of made him do something completely crazy. Um, So what do you do? I mean, are we just supposed to be aware of the forces when they're happening? We kind of take note of them and not let them take control, or just obviously knowing the forces doesn't help you avoid them.
Right. So the pilot is super interesting because that incident actually fundamentally changed the aviation industry.
Oh, it did.
So we look at the pilot and we could say, okay, well, if he was aware of his own psychology, maybe he wouldn't have made the decision. But I'm like, I don't know. Like, I've been in pretty stressed out situations, and I've felt loss aversion in different situations. It's very difficult to spot it yourself. What is a more effective measure is you look at the others around you in the team. So when you look at Van Zanten from KLM, again, this I asked the question of what was it like in the cabin with him, and when I asked this in corporate audiences, people are like, "Oh, I bet it was a tyrant," and I bet like we very quickly vilified this poor guy. It turns out he wasn't. He was actually a nice guy, very very sincere. The issue was that he comes in with this title of head of safety. Now, think about being the co-pilot in that airplane. And he's saying, like, we're taking off. And the co-pilot actually says, like, wait a second, we don't have clearance. And the 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 captain says, like, no, we're going anyways. How do you empower the co-pilot to be like, we're not going? How do you empower there are four roles that people play in any group. The first one is initiator, someone who says like, "Hey, let's do something. Let's go to Disneyland." And then you have the supporter who says like, "Oh, yeah, that seems like a great idea." You have the observer who's like, "Oh, it seems like you guys want to go to Disneyland." And you have the blocker who says like, "No, that's a horrible idea. Disneyland is closed, or we're in the middle of the pandemic, or whatever reason you have." And you have the tension between the initiator and the blocker. In the KLM example, the blocker wasn't given enough of a voice to be able to say like, no, we're not taking off into this foggy uh, runway. And again, I can tie this back to even how the U.S. military, when they were thinking about the invasion of Iraq, and they had the plans, and the plans were like, oh yeah, we're going to invade, it's going to be great, everyone's going to wave flags and congratulate us, and it's going to take a couple weeks. And there were folks who were like, no, this is going to be, I don't know if they even guessed that it would be a 20-year involvement, but they're like, this is not going to be what you guys are saying. And the blockers were silenced, and the military took this so seriously that they actually created an entire university within the army to give voice to the blockers.
Wow.
And in airplanes, there's something called cockpit resource management, which is you systematize specific actions. We're about to take off. Yes, we take off, and to give the specific members of the crew a voice in case something is going off script or in case something is being irrational. And you kind of tie that back actually to the conversation we just had before around Starfish. So that in order to be more efficient and effective in the crew, you need to empower the co-pilot,
Yeah.
and you need to empower other members of the flight team so that they can alert you when something terrible is about to happen.
Yeah. Well, I remember because one of the things that you talk about in the book is that you actually need people to be blockers or dissenters. You need people to challenge you. And if you don't have that in your organization and you have a bunch of yes men who just agree to whatever you say needs to get done, then that starts to create problems, right?
Yes, and the challenge is that no one wants to be a blocker.
Oh,
Like When was the last time you were like, oh my gosh, I had a meeting with someone and they told me that all my ideas really sucked. And my gosh, I feel so so great about that. So how do you protect this role that in our society is
Yeah.
so derided?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. I have no idea. I
And
think we try to give them cool names now, right? Don't we call them like change agents or catalysts now?
yes, exactly. So we're trying to give them cool names. We're trying to create a system to explain why they are important, but it's really easy to minimize their roles,
Yeah.
and it's really easy to collectively become irrational as an organization.
Hmm. So, for people who are watching and listening and they're thinking of this for themselves, for their careers as well, what's kind of the big takeaway for them? Is it to be aware of what these things are that can make you do irrational things and just be aware that they're happening and stop them? Or what do we actually do as a result?
Always be aware of the psychology of the situation,
Ah, okay.
and that we're always affected by, even very rational people are going to be affected by irrational forces.
Hmm.
And just like if you don't know who the starfish is in your industry, you're in trouble. If you don't know the ways in which you're irrational, you're in trouble.
Okay, so let's go into a little more detail on that one. So if you don't know the ways in which you're irrational, you're in trouble. So what does that actually mean? How do you start to figure that out?
Think about your investing. How much of your investing is based on loss aversion? You don't want to sell a stock or an investment at a loss, and you're going to keep on. That's happened to me. Um,
Yeah.
think about the people who work for you. How much are you committed to a course of action, despite the fact that it may or may not be the best course of action?
Yeah.
Think about in your company and in your organization, like how often do you say like, "Hey, that wasn't fair," and and you get really bent out of shape about that because of fairness, not because it's the rational thing to do or the irrational thing to do. And just understand that these are the forces that play with all of us, and we kind of put on these kind of, we pretend we're like, oh, you know what? These are other people. They're irrational. We're fine. We're rational. And
So
yeah,
once you understand the psychology of the situation and you understand the things that make you irrational, then what do you do?
then you create systems to overcome that irrationality that are
Ah,
going to be inherent to the
okay.
irrationality.
So what might that kind of a system look like?
So we talked about empowering blockers in organizations and what that might look like. You took a look about, I mean, this is something going on in our society today around fairness. So how do you create procedural justice, which is the notion of people feeling that they truly do have a voice, and that there's a system that allows their concerns to actually fully be heard.
Hmm.
Um, you recognize that it's going to be a part of one of the things we looked at is hiring and how horrible we are at making hiring decisions. Like we completely suck at it, and we all want to tell ourselves that we're really good at hiring, but we're really not. And the two approaches that you can have for hiring that are effective is um, look at someone's actual experience as and you see companies starting to implement this, and how their experience would actually um, be used in a given scenario. And the second element is having a very structured interview process with pre-scripted questions. And I teach a course in improvisation, which is weird for me to right to talk about, like, this needs to be scripted, this needs to be a group process, because a group interview is going to pick out more variants than one individual sitting and just kind of asking someone about whether or not you enjoy selling. I enjoy selling too. Let's talk about that for a while. That's not going to be a predictive at all in terms of how someone's going to do in the company.
Okay. So I think we covered a lot of different things about both books. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to. Actually, there was one other thing. Looking at my notes here from Sway, and it was the point that you made that perceived value is the same thing as real value, and it's one of the things that I talk about a lot as well, where perception is reality. And the example that I always give is that it doesn't matter how good of a leader you think you are. If people who work for you don't think you're a good leader, you're not a good leader. So I thought you could maybe expand on that topic a little bit around what does it mean when you say perceived value is real value, and how do we, how do we make that distinction between between the two for ourselves?
So once we once we assign a value, once we have value attribution towards a person or a thing, we tend to stick with that value perception. And one of the stories we looked at is Nathan's hot dogs and how when he started out in um, in his stand, he had this kind of recipe for hot dogs and realized that he can sell them for 5 cents. And um, no one really wanted them because all the other hot dogs were more expensive. So then he doubles the price to 10 cents and hires a bunch of folks who are dressed in kind of doctor's uniforms and stands there, markets him, and all of a sudden Nathan's becomes the Nathan that we know today because you have the perceived value of 10 cents being more than 5 cents, and you have the association with medical professions. Now you think about, let's look at two elements, one from the company perspective and one from the individual perspective. So from the company perspective, think about your product. What is the perceived value of your product? How are you marketing it? And people aren't going to just make a decision based on pure economics. People oftentimes, when given the choice, they'll usually choose the medium version, whatever it is, whether it's clothes or popcorn at the movie theaters, um, you'll choose medium. The other implication of this is on an individual level, and think about how you're perceived in your company
Yeah.
and pay incredible attention to creating your perceived value from the beginning. And I would say if you have a low perceived value in your organization, it might be time to think about getting a different job because once I see that person, like, I mean, I love stories where you see someone who's like, the receptionist and now they're the in the executive suite, and those all make us really happy, and I believe in
Yeah.
that. And at the same time, I've also seen a million cases where someone has that talent, but because they're in that organization and because they've had a lower job, people can never see them as executive material. And that when you go into a new job and you start with that new title, people will always see you in that title.
Hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like you can't. If your perceived value is a certain way, it's really hard to then change what your perceived value is, right?
Yes, people, and this is where the different irrationalities combine. So you have the perceived value, then you have commitment, right? And then we have our own loss aversion where we're like, I don't want to lose this job because for whatever reason, um, and that's when we start getting in real trouble. And think about that. That I mean, I know I have friends. It's interesting. So I have friends. I wonder if you have the same thing where um, I have friends from before I wrote books and friends from after I wrote a book. And the friends that I have, like I've I'm working on a couple of potential openings to the next book, and I read them to a couple of friends who knew me from before I wrote, and a couple of friends who knew me from after. And the friends who knew me from after were like, "Oh wow, this is amazing! This is fantastic! This is great! You know, like whatever you write is fantastic." And the ones from before are like, "Well, I don't get it." Like, I mean, they know that I I've sold a couple of books. They know that I can write, but they still don't look at me as a writer. I don't know if you have that yourself, where you kind of have pre-book and post-book friends.
Yeah, that's happened. I mean, it's really interesting just the types of feedback that you get from different people and of people who've known you, from you were younger versus people who know you when you're more kind of a business professional. So yeah, I've had very similar experiences. Totally get it. Well, we only have a couple minutes left, so I wanted to touch on one last thing. I understand you're working with Tom Rath, who has also been a guest on the podcast. Maybe you could share a little bit about what you guys are up to together.
Sure. So Tom and I decided to join forces, and
How'd you get
Tom,
connected, by the way?
he endorsed my second book, Sway, and is just a phenomenal human being who I'm a huge fan of. And then he reached out when he wrote when he wrote his next book, and just kind of wanted feedback, and we started a correspondence, and then eventually met in DC and realized that there's actually a really interesting intersection between our work. So my work is on networks and looking at specific nodes and how they're going to behave within that network, and Tom writes extensively about well-being. And when you combine those, when you look at the efficacy of a network, you have to look at the health of each node of the
Yeah.
network. It's going to be incredibly important, not only for the health of the overall network, but also for your own health as well. So that in your network, if people are feeling drained, that's going to actually drain you. And that in order to energize the network, you need to energize yourself. So we opened a 100-acre center outside of DC called the Fully Charged Institute,
Is it already
and
open?
we're just opening it. Yes,
I'm gonna have
it's
to
it,
check
it,
this
it,
out.
it, it's finished, and now assuming that COVID actually is reopening, it's ready to go. So we're launching it,
I'm
and
looking it up as we speak. The Fully Charged Institute.
yes,
Okay, I see it here. Charginglab.com.
chargealarm.com.
Interesting. Okay, and so what happens here?
So we realized that a lot of the work that we do is we talk about networks, we talk about energizing folks, and oftentimes it's like in these hotel rooms, and I think it's hotel like or hotel conference rooms where it's like, there isn't a window inside. uh, there's donuts and coffee, and you're like, okay, everyone, and energize your network. And we realized that we wanted to do a lot more of our work in somewhere that is closer to nature, is open, has gives the people the ability to actually interact in different ways. And what we've observed is, especially as we're emerging out of the pandemic, people used to rely on very kind of basic tools for culture,
Yeah,
right? Like you're like bright walls, a ping pong table, and those are not good enough in today's world as we're becoming more distributed as organizations. So companies bring together their leadership teams and talk about both the culture in an intentional way, but also about how we can better energize individuals in the team and
got it.
individuals across the organization.
Okay, got it. Very cool. Yeah, I was just on the website. It looks fascinating. Well, Ori, we are pretty much at the top of the hour. Where can people go to learn more about you, check out your books, and some of the fun stuff that you're working on?
You can check out my website. It's oribrafman.com and charginglab.com for the fully charged student. And you're invited. You have to come visit, Jacob.
I would love to. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I was just looking at the pictures on the website. I mean, it looks beautiful. It's one of those places where you get there, you probably won't want to leave.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's the idea.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks everyone for tuning in. My guest again, Ori Brafman. Make sure to check out his books, and you can check out his new institute that he's working on with Tom Rath, and I will see all of you next week. Thanks again for tuning into today's episode. Please remember to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or whatever your preferred channel is. I cannot express how important those reviews and ratings are to the success of this show, and they keep allowing me to bring back amazing guests. Lastly, don't forget to check out the brand new PDF that I just put out, which looks at the evolution of the employee. In other words, how employees are evolving and changing, and what you as an organization should do to adapt. You'll get a complete breakdown of what that evolution looks like, as well as action items that you can and should be taking. That PDF is available at thefutureemployee.com. And if you want to reach out to me for whatever reason, whether it's inviting me to speak, sponsoring the show, or just giving me some feedback, you can always do so. My email is jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Again, that's jacob@thefutureorganization.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.